Here's our political correspondent, Tom Barton.
What can the Prime Minister do to get her Brexit deal approved by MPs? The answer, according to one of her ministers today, appears to be not a lot. Writing in the Daily Mail, the Work and Pensions Secretary Amber Rudd says the government needs to acknowledge the risk that pursuing the deal as it stands could lead to no compromise, no agreement and no deal. So, she says, politicians must abandon outrage and accusations and try to forge a consensus. But that assessment is rejected by her cabinet colleague, the Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt. He insisted today it will be possible to get a version of the deal through Parliament.
Let's be clear, the deal on the table is what we have, but the thing that the House of Commons will not accept is any risk of us being permanently trapped through the Northern Irish backstop in the customs union. And despite all the difficulties of this week, I think it is possible to get this deal through with those guarantees that we need on the backstop.
One former minister who resigned from the government last month to push for another referendum says the Commons vote on the deal, delayed last week, must take place before Christmas.
I've got absolutely no doubt that if the vote is deferred again when we come back on Monday, that very serious conversations will be had by members of the Cabinet and members of the Parliament asking, well, what is the strategy? It's simply unacceptable to run out the clock and face the country with the prospect of being timed out.
We still don't know when MPs will get to vote, and clearly today there are Cabinet disagreements about exactly what they should get to vote on. Tom Barton, BBC News.
A large fire has broken out at Chester Zoo, prompting an evacuation of visitors and animals. According to the zoo, the blaze broke out in its monsoon forest habitat. It said teams were working to move all visitors and animals away from the fire. Tens of thousands of police have been deployed across France in preparation for a fifth weekend in succession of anti-government protests. There are reports that demonstrators blocked the port of Calais this morning. In Paris, several hundred people marched along the Champs-Élysées. From the French capital, Hugh Schofield has sent this report.
A moment of tension on the Champs-Élysées. A group of yellow vests comes up against a police cordon. Noise, but not much fury. The tension subsides. The authorities were ready for the worst. As the day began, once again, thousands of riot police were on the streets, searching protesters for hidden projectiles. But so far the day has been, in general, peaceful, even good-humoured. A group of feminists came to lend their support to the yellow vests, but overall the numbers are way down. These are the hardliners in the movement, who want more concessions from President Macron, beyond the 10 billion euros in spending pledges for the low-paid that he promised last week. Still noisy, but this is not a protest on the same scale as previous Saturdays. Some have come, more have stayed away. Hugh Schofield, BBC News, Paris.
A boat carrying suspected migrants has been picked up off the coast of Dover by the Border Force. In the last 3 months, more than 100 migrants are known to have attempted crossing the English Channel, the world's busiest shipping lane. UN climate talks in Poland, which were due to end yesterday, have been extended to allow delegates more time to try to agree a consensus on how to limit global warming. Talks continued through the night on contentious issues, including how poorer countries should be compensated for the damage caused by global warming. Delegates are also trying to agree rules on how to implement earlier pledges they made to cut emissions. Journeys using the 2 crossings which span the River Severn into South Wales will soon be toll-free. The barriers on the M4 Prince of Wales Bridge are being dismantled first, with work planned for the M48 bridge on Monday. There is some disruption and drivers are being warned to plan their journeys in advance. Our Wales correspondent Sian Lloyd has more, and just a warning that her report does contain some flashing images.
Crossing the River Severn into South Wales has until now always come at a price. Some 25 million journeys a year are made. Lorry driver Craig Evans makes more than most. For 17 years he's been delivering goods from Wales across the border.
This could be halfway over the bridge. and you're losing time, you're driving time, you're late getting the goods delivered. It's just horrific.
His firm makes 31,000 crossings every year. Until recently, lorries were charged £20 a time.
It's good for my company. They got more money in to invest, which will create more jobs, but the side that I'm not looking forward to is the traffic which is going to come into Wales, and my point of view is going to cause more congestion.
To commemorate the first crossing of the Severn Bridge, I have great pleasure in unveiling this plaque.
In 1966, the completion of the first bridge across the Severn caused huge excitement, but the volume of traffic multiplied, and 30 years later, the Prince of Wales opened a second Severn crossing. When this bridge returned to public ownership, the UK government announced that the tolls would go. Around 100 staff were affected, among them Darren Moore, who says he's sad to be losing his job but does have fond memories of his time in the toll booths.
You get people turn up and they go, is this the way to Exeter? Is this the way to Scotland? Because they've taken a wrong turn in, and then you have to break the news that they're actually just about to enter Wales.
Work is now underway to remove the barriers. The aim is to save drivers money and encourage more investment in the South Wales economy. But it's predicted that scrapping the tolls will increase traffic on what's already a congested stretch of the motorway. Sian Lloyd, BBC News on the M4.
Now, it is a bit of a journey between here and the sports centre, but I can assure you that Mike Bushell is at least toll-free. Good afternoon to you, Mike.
Yes, no extra charges with me. Good afternoon. England's men are out of the Hockey World Cup in India after being outclassed in their semi-final against Belgium. They were hoping to make their first final since 1986, but the Belgians were far too strong and won 6-0. So England will now play for third place against Australia or the Netherlands. Manchester City will return to the top of the Premier League today if they can beat Everton at the Etihad this lunchtime, with leaders Liverpool not playing until tomorrow. Now, Everton have a really good recent record against City, but they are behind in the first half. Gabriel Jesus putting the champions one up, and it's still 1-0 after 38 minutes. Now, could the use of the whip be banned in horse racing within the next few years? Well, the BBC understands that senior figures are preparing for that possibility, with tougher penalties in big races likely to be introduced to try and improve public perception. A new penalty structure for overusing the whip will be announced next month. No suggestion of that in these pictures from Bangor-on-Dee near Chester yesterday, but Paul Struthers from the Professional Jockeys Association says it won't make a bit of difference to horse welfare. Talking of horses, it's over 3 years since Sir A.P. McCoy retired from professional jump racing, but next week the 20-time champion jockey will be back in the saddle for a charity event at the London International Horse Show at Olympia. Ahead of that, McCoy has been given a few tips to some of the next generation of jockeys, as Nick Hope reports from Ascot.
All I ever want to do is to be a jockey. Retirement's hard. When you are lucky enough to win one of those great big sporting events, it's irreplaceable to try and find something that will replace that buzz.
Sir A.P. McCoy clearly misses the thrill of racing, but he has discovered a new passion by guiding some of the next generation of jockeys who'll be in the Shetland Pony Grand National at Olympia next week.
It's a great thing to get kids involved in our sport, and if you can give a little bit back and get those kids interested, it's brilliant.
It was really exciting to meet the champion jockey A.P. McCoy.
Every part of the race you need to be thinking, can I beat all the others at this point?
He told us his tactics when he was a jockey, and how the start and the end is the most important. I love riding a lot.
What's the most special part?
Winning, probably.
I'm jealous, I'd love to be starting off again and having the dream of coming to Ascot and riding a winner at Ascot when you're a little bit older,
The days of A.P. McCoy powering to victory here at Ascot may be just memories now, but the 20-time champion jockey has enjoyed a very active retirement and will be back in the saddle for this year's Olympia, taking on a very different jumping challenge.
It's such a great event, even as a jump jockey, but going there obviously mainly show jumping. The atmosphere is amazing. Last year we had 5 champion flat jockeys and 5 champion jump jockeys, and luckily we won. This year we've got a boys against the girls team. It's good competition. But the most important thing is that you win.
It may be for charity, but clearly neither that nor retirement has dulled McCoy's desire to ride winners. Nick Hope, BBC News.
Oh, great to see the legend back in the saddle there. Now, the first race of the Formula E season for electric cars has just finished in Saudi Arabia. This season, the cars have longer battery lives, and so there's no need to change the cars during the races. And it was BMW Andretti driver Antonio Felix da Costa who won from pole. That is only a second win. Reigning champion Jules-Éric Vergne came in second, while Oliver Rowland was the highest finishing Brit in 7th place, but GB's Gary Paffett, well, he had car problems and his race ended early. Yes, the whistle rather than the roar of the engines there. That's all for now, Sean. Back to you.
Silence is golden. Mike Gush, well, thank you very much. Don't forget you can see more on all of today's stories throughout the afternoon on the BBC News channel. The next news on BBC One, though, is at 5:20. Do have a good afternoon. Bye for now.
The moments that define the year. Review 2018, all next week on the BBC News channel.
Stories set to shape the news agenda. Headlines freshly written. Original perspectives on the day's unfolding narratives. See the bigger picture as it emerges. The Papers, tonight at 10:30 and 11:30 on the BBC News channel.
Hello, you're watching the BBC News channel with me, Sean Lay. Let's get more now on our top story, Brexit. And with just a few days left before the House of Commons rises for the Christmas recess, the disarray over the policy continues, including within the Cabinet. Earlier, I spoke to the political commentator and columnist Tim Montgomery about the impact this is having on the Conservative Party itself.
I think what we are probably beginning to see, and I think it's something we've needed to see for quite a while, is the Cabinet asserting itself. I think up until now, Theresa May's most difficult and constructive relationship and sometimes destructive relationship is within her own parliamentary party. You've seen backbenchers asserting themselves. Their failure this week to force her out of the Tory leadership means that they can't challenge her really in any significant way for a year. And so I think the Cabinet now have the opportunity and indeed the duty to actually force Theresa May out of her comfort zone and perhaps force a little bit more realism on her as to whether she can get the kind of changes needed in order for this, with her own withdrawal agreement, to pass.
Is that possible when we know that the Cabinet itself has very different views?
Well, that's the problem. You have a Cabinet with very different views, and it's not even clear to me that Amber Rudd's intervention in the Daily Mail this morning, was this something that Downing Street wanted her to do, to start opening up the possibility
of alternatives to the Prime Minister's deal, to which we are told there is no alternative.
Exactly, building with MPs from other parties. Or was this a freelance operation that Downing Street has had to tolerate? I don't know which of those two it is, but Amber Rudd was making noises during her brief period outside of the Cabinet, talking openly about a second referendum, backing the Norway plan. So here you have one of Theresa May's most senior cabinet ministers taking a position which he took, now that she's back in government, which she took outside, but very different, for example, from Liam Fox, the Trade Secretary, who is probably much closer to wanting a managed no-deal Brexit.
And has said openly that it might be that the Cabinet won't allow this to go back to a vote a second time.
Which is why your question about the division in the Cabinet is so important, because when Liam Fox says the Cabinet won't allow it, who's he speaking for? He's certainly not speaking for the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, who this last week has described those people who want to manage no deal as extremists.
You are old enough, as I am, to remember the last time the party had a kind of collective nervous breakdown over Europe, and that was at the end of the major government. There have been one or two in history, and other parties have had their crises as well over the years, and some have split over it, and people have talked about the Conservative Party splitting. When you look at some of the rhetoric, some of the language, some of the contempt, open contempt, shown by different Conservatives for each other, does that now look possible?
The contempt, I think you're right to talk about how personal it's become. It's gone way past ideology now, and we could both mention some pretty horrible examples of way Conservative MPs now talk to each other. I don't think a split is on the cards yet. I think the thing that would do it would be a second referendum. I think if you look at polling of the population at large, you see the public fairly divided about a second referendum. But Tory members and Tory voters, it's like 4-1 against a referendum.
So that really would be pouring petrol on the fire.
I think if you wanted to sort of think about setting up a new political party, a sense of betrayal on that issue, so fundamental to 40 years of getting to this point for the Conservative Party, holding a referendum, saying it would be honoured, then failing to implement it, I think that is existential for the Conservative Party.
And when, therefore, Amber Rudd openly says, I will get accused of betrayal when I talk about reaching out to other parties. But is there not a sensible, pragmatic view of saying, whether it's to get a second referendum or whether it's to look at other options, if the Conservative Party, there's no majority for the Prime Minister's deal, if the DUP won't support it, that presumably deal is, one way or another, probably dead. And if the party can't agree on it, then you do have to reach out.
Yes, you do. And one of the reasons I have upset a lot of my fellow Brexiteers in backing the withdrawal agreement, I'm a reluctant supporter of what Theresa May brought back from Brussels. But my fear is this is going to be the best kind of Brexit any Brexiteer can hope for. And what will happen, inevitably, something has got to pass the House of Commons. House of Parliament, I don't think, will allow no deal. So the Norway or other options are certainly a more diluted form of Brexit than Theresa May's. And that is what I think my fellow Brexiteers are risking.
Tim Montgomery, the Conservative political commentator, talking to me a little earlier. Right now, let's go back to a story we talked about in the last hour or so, the reports we were getting of a fire having broken out at Chester Zoo. These are some updated pictures we have from David Waring, and you can see at the time these pictures were taken, the smoke was extensive, but you could also see fire. This is from Sophie Flynn, and what you saw, this incident was first noticed about 11:30 this morning by neighbours who saw the fire and the smoke that followed from it. A large number of emergency crews turned up, and we're told fire engines were there very quickly, and eventually most of the fire was out, but the smoke was continuing. There's a second, smaller fire, we're told, which has continued to burn. This, though, is on the monsoon forest habitat, which is the largest zoological building, largest indoor zoo exhibit in the UK that we've ever had and that we have now. So it's a big space. It's a space that accommodates, among other things, orangutan and a number of bird species. The important thing to know is that visitors at the monsoon forest habitat were evacuated, as were other visitors from the zoo, as a precaution. What we're not clear about yet is what, if any, animals based in that part of the zoo, in the monsoon forest habitat, may have been affected by the fire or potentially injured by the fire. Efforts were being made, certainly, to move the animals to other parts of the zoo and to evacuate people, visitors and staff completely from the site. We're told that there are still, eyewitness reports are that there's still smoke, but the main fire has been extinguished. Nonetheless, because the roof is inflatable, it's likely to have done considerable damage to that roof and potentially to the structure below it. And obviously that's something that fire investigators will have to consider, not only obviously the cause, but also the safety of the structure that's left behind by this fire. So it's a fire in the monsoon forest habitat, in the inflatable ceiling over that habitat, which has been burning 7:30 this morning at Chester Zoo, but there are no reports of any injuries. Now, 28 people were injured when a tram derailed and overturned last night in the Portuguese capital, Lisbon. Reports said the tram came off the rails on a bend at the bottom of a steep hill before hitting a building. Most of the casualties were taken to hospital, but none of them is believed to be in a serious condition. The UK Airprox Board has reported an incident of the highest risk of collision between a plane and a drone. A plane landing at Stansted Airport in Essex last summer came within 50 feet of a drone which was being flown at more than 20 times the allowed height. Drones must not be flown in airspace or above 400 foot without permission from air traffic control. A British sailor who was rescued after her boat capsized during a solo round the world race has said she'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Susie Goodall was picked up after several days stranded on her wrecked boat. She'd been hit by a storm 2,000 miles west of Cape Horn. Yesterday she arrived back in Chile and was reunited there with Mum and her brother. Campaigners are urging the government to stop plans to issue prison officers with a synthetic pepper spray to help to tackle violence in jails. The Prison Reform Trust says that during trials the spray, known as Pava, was used unsafely and inappropriately. The prison service says lessons have been learnt from the pilot and there'll be clear rules on how the sprays should be used in future. Now, how we care for older people is a complicated issue made more difficult in Europe by falling birth rate, meaning that there are fewer young people paying taxes to fund care for the elderly. So can we learn anything from other European countries or indeed other parts of the world? Well, Japan has the world's oldest population. Our Tokyo correspondent Rupert Wingfield-Hayes has been to see what they do as part of our Who Cares series.
Deep in the mountains, 2 hours north of Tokyo, Nanmoku is now the oldest town in Japan. Once a week, Sakiko and Yutaka Ando drive their mobile shop up into these valleys. At each street corner, they turn the music up and wait for their customers. The young have all left for the city. Now only the old remain. For them, the Ando's mobile shop is a lifeline.
So you're like a social service, checking on everybody each week.
I think Nanmoku village would be more deserted without us coming here. These villagers are what we call shopping refugees.
We owe a lot to people here. We've known them for over 30 years, so we want to do what we can to help them.
All over rural Japan, there are more and more places like this where the vast majority of the population are in their 60s or older. By the middle of the century, more than 40% of Japan's total population are going to be old-age pensioners. No other country in the world has ever experienced that before. It's not just a question of how they're going to pay to look after all these old people. It's who is going to do the caring.
Japan has a well-funded system. Everyone over 40 must pay into it. That pays for people like Yoko Sawa. Today, she and her colleagues are going door to door, checking on pensioners. But this system is already under huge strain, and the reason is dementia. In another neighborhood, Ryu Uzawa has come to check on 90-year-old Kiyomizu Shirai. A year ago, Mr. Shirai's wife Kyoko was diagnosed with dementia, and now she needs almost constant care.
Sometimes she waits outside the front door until late at night. She thinks our children are coming to collect her. I try to persuade her to come in, but she refuses.
There are already 5 million people in Japan suffering with dementia. By 2025, that will rise to 7 million. Where Japan goes, the rest of the world will soon follow. But even here, no one is sure how it is going to work. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, BBC News in Gunma, central Japan.
Japan, they're a country whose birth rate has been falling for more than 40 years. Right, now let's take a look at the weather prospects, and it is, to say the least, Chris Fawkes, a very busy weather weekend.
Yeah, you're not wrong, Sean. Yeah, there's an awful lot going on weather-wise.
Some of it will bring absolutely treacherous conditions, particularly to the northern half of the country. And it's all courtesy of Storm Deirdre, bringing a combination of freezing rain that will bring widespread ice and also some heavy snow. The amber weather warnings for snow affecting parts of Scotland, 10 to 20 centimetres expected, but ice not just affecting Scotland, but reaching across northern England and into the Midlands as well. This is what's going on then. We've got cold air with temperatures still below freezing fairly widely across the north of the UK. Into that, low pressure moves in. This is Deirdre, and it's bringing that mixture of ice and snow, particularly for the northern half of the country. So we'll concentrate on Scotland over the next 18 hours or so. Some freezing rain bringing icy conditions. Also, there'll be some heavy snow around as well. The heaviest of the snow will be going to the north of the central belt, where we're likely to see accumulations of 10 to 20 centimetres building in as we go on through this afternoon, this evening and overnight as well. Blizzard conditions on account of the strong winds, so poor visibility, dangerous driving conditions out and about, treacherous on the roads. But ultimately, it will be turning milder by the end of the night as those westerly winds begin to blow back in. Further southwards for Northern Ireland, it's a wet and windy day here with outbreaks of rain. There will be some freezing rain for Northern England, truly treacherous conditions here, and there will be some snow mixed in with that as well. Further south, it's just cold rain that falls for the most part. Then it gets very windy. Northwest England, West Wales could get gusts of wind this evening, reaching 75 miles an hour. Again, that could cause some problems, but ultimately, we'll see a change to milder conditions as well by the end of the night. Temperatures lifting well above freezing, blowing all that cold air out of the way. So, just to sum up, what we're expecting this afternoon, this evening and overnight really, is that Storm Deirdre will bring some atrocious conditions out and about on the roads. Travel could well be disrupted significantly, and there's a high chance of seeing some power cuts as well across the north. By the time we get to Sunday, what this is really about is it's about the transition to milder weather. For Sunday, we've got outbreaks of rain across western and southern parts of the UK, but look at the temperatures, 6 to 10 degrees Celsius. It is turning milder, and that process continues into the week ahead as well, with temperatures up to around 12 degrees Celsius or so as we head through the next few days. In the short term, though, truly atrocious conditions out and about on the roads, the rails, airports could be affected. We may well see some power cuts. I think the worst of the problems are likely to be across northern England and Scotland. So stay tuned to the forecast right here. We'll keep you updated with what's going on over the next few hours. That's the latest.
Some days of the week are just different. Get your fill of travel, sport and documentaries. Weekends on the BBC News Channel.
Another record-breaking year of sporting success. Trophy after medal after trophy after medal. Enjoy the victories and know there are proud nations supporting you.
England win a World Cup penalty shootout.
Here's to a great year of sport. BBC Sports Personality of the Year. This year's Personal Best. Live tomorrow from 7 on BBC One and BBC iPlayer.
Hello, you're watching BBC News with me, Sean Lay. The headlines this hour. The Work and Pension Secretary calls for a cross-party consensus to find a way forward on Brexit, as the Foreign Secretary says it's still possible to get a version of the Prime Minister's deal through the House of Commons. Firefighters are tackling a large blaze at Chester Zoo this lunchtime. Visitors and animals have been evacuated from the monsoon forest habitat. UN climate talks in Poland have been extended after continuing through the night. Countries are trying to agree the way forward for the Paris Agreement. A warning of freezing rain, ice and snow in parts of the UK as Storm Deirdre hits on what's one of the busiest shopping weekends of the year. This is the scene live in Paris, where protesters have taken to the streets for a fifth successive weekend of anti-government demonstrations. Now on BBC News, our special programme looking back at a year of commemorations of the Armistice Centenary.
Last month, Europe marked the end of a terrible conflict. The First World War cost millions of lives and ruined millions more. A century on from the armistice, this generation paused to remember tragedies, both global and personal.
You just cannot believe what man can do to man.
I mean, I'm known in the village as the Poppy Lady now.
This is the Imperial War Museum in London. Today, along with its sister sites around the UK, it reflects world conflict across the generations. The museum was founded back in 1917 to tell the story of the First World War. Last month, the Duchess of Cambridge was here to see a cascade of poppies marking British and Commonwealth lives lost. Around Britain, the centenary of the armistice brought thousands more events in cities, towns, villages, and even on our beaches. The film director Danny Boyle, who masterminded the 2012 Olympic opening ceremony in London, led an initiative to create sand portraits of soldiers lost on the battlefields. Sean Peel from BBC Look East watched one project unfolding at Brancaster in Norfolk.
A crisp autumn afternoon on Brancaster Beach, tide out, bright lighting the scene as families and walkers enjoyed just being together, a perfect Sunday to remember those no longer here. With the wet sand providing a canvas, work began to create a portrait of a man who died in the Great War. There and gone like the tide, never to return to these shores. They're creating an image of driver Stephen Hewitt. He was born in Halvergate in Norfolk and died in 1916, aged 37.
Well, luckily sand is quite flexible, so you can always sort of cover over a little bit if it's not working. But yeah, we wanted to be careful. We worked in pairs to keep checking that we were doing it right, and I think we're really pleased with the end result.
Stephen Hewitt was a driver in the field artillery looking after the horses used to take the guns into battle. He was fighting the Bulgarians in Greece, but one day out riding he was attacked by a pack of wolves and died of his injuries. For Amelia Ord, it was an emotional day. Stephen Hewitt was her great-granddad. She only heard it happening 2 days before, a chance glance at a piece in a newspaper, so she drove here from Newcastle.
Very emotional. I've cried all the way down on the journey today. I always find Remembrance Sunday emotional, and I think it's because I do, I'm interested in our family history, and today, much more. So we made sure we stopped at 11 o'clock to do a 2 minutes, silence, and it's been tugging at the heartstrings all morning. We'll be here till it's dark.
The centuries' tides, chanting their bitter psalms, cannot heal it. Not the war to end all wars, death's birthing place.
As the light faded, a poem was recited, Pages of the Sea by the poet laureate Carol Ann Duffy.
History might as well be water, chastising this shore, for we learn nothing from your endless sacrifice.
At the going down of the day at Brancaster, those who came to remember left before nightfall, leaving the incoming tide to take driver Stephen Hewitt into its arms.
The armistice commemorations have centred on lives lost in combat. But as Jerry Jackson from BBC Look North discovered, among the graves of those killed during 4 years of bloodshed are others of men who died after the fighting stopped.
Our First World War dead lie in hundreds of Commonwealth war cemeteries on the battlefields of Europe, the Middle East and Africa. But more than 130,000 of them died in the UK. This is Sunderland. As the leaves fell in 1918, many relatives must have thought their loved ones had made it through the worst. Private Robert Reevely is wounded in France in mid-October and is invalided back to a hospital in the Midlands, where he dies on the 10th of November. It's almost certain that his wife Kate in Roker would have received the telegram on Armistice Day, perhaps as the church bells were ringing and People were in the streets celebrating. On the 12th, she writes to his regiment asking for the return of his personal belongings. She says, "I shall be very grateful if you will oblige me in this matter. It may seem a small thing to ask for, but it means a lot to me." Andrew Neil had been blinded in the war. He died 6 months after the armistice and should have had a military headstone. For nearly a century, he lay in an unmarked grave.
The problem was that his death certificate said Jacksonian epilepsy, but it wasn't attributing that to war injuries. We knew that he died as a result of the Great War. Then, sometime later, we got his pension disability card.
And this is it.
And this is it. Same cause of death, but in small letters, due to active service. You know, the man gave his eyes and his life for his country, and now he's got something back to recognise that.
My mum and my aunties just said my granddad was blind in the First World War. Never knew anything else. To see the stone now, and especially when you drive up the road and it gleams, it's just fantastic.
Sergeant Neil's story is one of many researched by the Northumbria World War I Commemoration Project, a 7-year community volunteer remembrance endeavour. John Ewell from County Durham had won the Victoria Cross in the Italian Alps in the summer of 1918. He was killed 4 days before the fighting ended there in October. News of his death only reached his family on Armistice Day. You can't help wondering what these people would have become, what they would have gone on to do. Collectively, they made a sacrifice which we can scarcely imagine today, and surely for that at least we should remain grateful.
This anniversary, perhaps more than any other, has drawn us into our own family history. 80-year-old Andrew Sturt from Surrey had never visited the battlefields, but he wanted to find the graves of 3 uncles who still lie on the Western Front. BBC South Today went with him.
Andrew and his son Richard are making a special journey. Aged 80, Andrew sees this as his last chance to visit the graves of his 3 uncles who all died fighting in France. He's never made this trip before. They head to Noyon Cemetery in the north of France.
We're getting close to the British section now, where your Uncle Harold lies.
Andrew's father Edwin would have found these visits too painful to make. Edwin had answered the call to fight for king and country, as had 5 of his brothers, ordinary country lads from Chobham village in Surrey. Against the odds, all 6 were still alive 4 years later. But in the final year of the war, that would change.
It's just frightening, isn't it? You just cannot believe what man can do to man.
Harold was the first brother to die. He was a lorry driver for the Army Service Corps, delivering supplies to the front line. One day he drove over an unexploded shell and died instantly.
That's very sad, isn't it?
Age 28.
Yeah. He was the oldest of the 3 who died. Yeah. He lived to almost the end of the war, and then he and his 2 brothers died in very quick succession.
Carrying on their journey, the next grave is especially poignant. Andrew's uncle Reginald is buried here. Of all the brothers, he was particularly close to Andrew's own father.
My father's written a letter to his uncle. You were so cruelly taken from the family by that sniper's bullet on your first day of active service.
We will remember you.
There is one more cemetery to visit, the grave of Herbert. Just 2 months before the war would finally come to an end, Herbert was killed, aged 19.
And it was his sacrifice which broke your grandmother's heart.
That was the final straw, undoubtedly.
In the last year of the war, the Sturts had lost 3 sons in the space of 6 months. Tragic, but not unusual. Many families had been robbed of their young men, a lost generation who had made the ultimate sacrifice.
The Sturt brothers were part of what was dubbed the lost generation. Small communities were hardest hit, fighting to survive without the young men who'd marched off to war. And as Jackie O'Brien from Reporting Scotland discovered, even those who returned faced a harsh future.
The Cameron Highlanders left the north of Scotland in their droves, full of youth and hope that their job would be done by Christmas. But many of them didn't return, and it later emerged that the number of Highland servicemen killed in action more than doubled the national average.
The loss of young men was catastrophic. The work on the croft, crofting and fishing are both activities that require fit, strong young men, and a lot of them just weren't there. So the work on the crofts had to be done quite often by old men and women. The sense of gloom that pervaded the whole community must have been palpable.
Donald Angus Shaw was too young to fight at first, but he defied his parents and left his family croft near Portree as soon as he turned 16. He died at Arras on the Western Front a year later, one of a total of 600 Skye men lost to the island community.
Just a lost generation really, because many of them had